Welcome, everyone. I'm Katy Milkman. I'm a professor at the Wharton School and co-director of the Behavior Change for Good initiative here. And I'm going to also let Angela introduce herself.
The only thing I'm going to say in this webinar is, hi, I'm Angela Duckworth, and I co-direct the Behavior Change for Good initiative with Katy, and I am hanging out just watching this.
We're very excited to be here. We're thrilled to welcome you, audience, or welcome you back to this special keynote event, which we're co-hosting with the Center for Health Incentives and Behavioral Economics, or CHIBE. And we are joined today by our colleague and co-host, Atheendar. I actually am going to mispronounce your name, Atheendar. Can I ask you to tell me the correct pronunciation of your last name so I don't do that?
Yeah, no problem. Venkataramani.
Venkataramani. Really awesome to know that. I will never get it wrong again, I promise. He's an associate professor at the Perelman School of Medicine here at Penn, and he is going to be the one who introduces today's speaker, and we will be co-hosting the Q&A at the end.
Hey, amazing. Thanks so much, Katy. I'm really thrilled to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Raj Chetty. He's the William Ackman Professor of Public Economics at Harvard University, and he directs Opportunity Insights, a research institute that uses big data to explore how to improve economic opportunity for children from all backgrounds. Professor Chetty's groundbreaking work has really reshaped our understanding of social and economic mobility in America, and his research has demonstrated how neighborhood, education, social connections can significantly influence a child's chance of success in this country. His contributions have earned him numerous awards, including the MacArthur Fellowship, the John Bates Clark Medal, and the Infosys Prize for the Social Sciences. And he's also one of the youngest tenured professors in Harvard's history. We're excited to hear today about the science of economic opportunity, new insights from big data. And please join me in welcoming Professor Chetty. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Athene. Thank you, Katy. Thank you, Angela. It's wonderful to be here with all of you, and thank you for organizing this. So let me share my slides here. Hopefully folks are seeing this come up. So I'm going to talk today about the science of economic opportunity. And I want to start by talking about a map that has been on my mind for the past 10 years. It's from a study that my colleagues and I did 10 years ago called the Land of Opportunity, where we used, for the first time, large-scale administrative data from anonymized tax returns to understand the geography of economic opportunity in the United States. So let me take a second to describe how we constructed this map, what we learned from it, and why I'm showing it to you today, and how we've made progress in the field over the past decade in understanding these issues. So what we did here is used data from tax returns on all kids born back in 1978 in the US. That's about 3.5 million children. We linked those children back to their parents and back to the specific county in which they grew up. And in each county, we calculated a very simple measure of upward mobility. We asked, suppose you grew up in a low-income family, which for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to define as a family at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution. That corresponds to a household income of about $27,000 a year. We asked, suppose you grew up in such a family, how much are you yourself making when we follow you into adulthood and measure your own income off of your 1040 tax return when you're 35 years old? So for example, in the Philadelphia area, where I know a number of you are, in Penn, kids starting out in families making $27,000 a year, when we look at them at age 35, they're on average making $31,000 a year. We can similarly construct that statistic for every county in America, and we color the map so that the red-orange colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility, where kids growing up in low-income families are less likely to rise up and achieve the American dream. And the green colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility. Now, if you start by just looking at the scale in the lower right-hand side of this map, you will see that there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up across different parts of the US. There are some parts of America, like Dubuque, Iowa, for example, or much of the rural Midwest, where kids growing up in families making $27,000 a year, on average, are making $45,000 or even $50,000 a year in the next generation. Yet there are other places, take Charlotte, North Carolina, for example, where kids starting out in families at that exact same income level, $27,000 a year, when they're in their mid-30s, they're making actually less than their parents were, $26,000 a year, which is kind of shocking if you think about it, given the amount of economic growth that has occurred in the United States over the past 30 years. So this map was of interest to us and to the field for two reasons, I think. First, it gave us a new lens, a microscope, if you will, to study the science of economic opportunity. We could start to ask questions like, what's different about rural Iowa versus the rural South? What happens when a child moves from one of these red-colored places to one of these green-colored places? Do their outcomes change? What are the factors that really drive differences in economic mobility? But second, this kind of data also, once we have that scientific understanding, can give us insight into how we might make policy changes. What can we do in these red-colored areas to improve economic mobility there, maybe to replicate the successes that we're seeing in other parts of the US, and thereby expand economic opportunity for all. And so motivated by that two-part logic, wanting to understand the science and then ultimately have an impact on policy, the way I'm going to structure this talk today is, in the first half, give you just a quick overview of what we've learned about the determinants of economic opportunity through this sort of analysis over the past decade or so in our research team, through the work of many other scholars. And in the second part of the talk, pivot to turn about how we can take that set of research findings to actually implement changes on the ground, to change policies, to change the initiatives we currently have to expand economic opportunity. So I'm going to start by showing you first some recent work we've done, looking at how this map that I just showed you here for kids born back in 1978 is changing over time in America. How is economic opportunity changing in the United States? And so to do that, I'm going to go to this next slide here, where I'll start with the map, version of the map that I just showed you before. But now I'm going to subset the data by race. This turns out to be quite important for a reason that will become clear in a second. Here I'm going to show you the data for white kids born to low-income parents at the 25th percentile, same exact statistics on rates of upward mobility by county, and you can see that the patterns look very similar to what I showed you in that first map. Now, when we first started to do this sort of analysis 10 years ago, we were only able to look at kids born in the late 1970s because they had to be old enough for us to measure their incomes at age 35 at the point that we were writing that paper in 2014. Now, simply thanks to the gift of time, a decade has passed, we can now replicate this map looking at more recent birth cohorts. And that's what we're doing in this map on the right here, where we're calculating exactly the same statistics with the same methodology, but now for white children born in 1992. And what you can see is that there's been a remarkable change in economic opportunity for white kids growing up in low-income families. Those red colors that you see on the map on the left have essentially spread across the United States. It used to be the case that if you were a white child growing up in parts of the Northeast or parts of California, you had a pretty good shot of reaching the middle class. No longer true. You can see that those areas have become essentially red. And much of the US now looks like the lowest opportunity places that we saw back in 1978, like parts of Appalachia, where children growing up in low-income families, white kids in particular, don't have great chances of rising up. So opportunity is receding in that way. Now, when we look at the same data for Black children, we see a very different pattern. So in this map here, we're showing the same statistics on upward mobility for Black kids, but now with a different color scale for a reason that will become evident in a second. The purple colors here represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. The peach-orange colors are areas with higher levels of upward mobility. This is the data for 1978. I should note that much of the map is blank because we don't have a sufficiently large Black population in those areas to construct these statistics. But here we see the data for 1978. Now we can again replicate the map in the areas where we have a sufficiently large Black population in 1992, and we actually see exactly the opposite pattern of what we saw for white kids, where upward mobility is increasing, opportunities expanding for Black kids growing up in low-income families. The map is turning from purple to the peach-orange color. Now, this is encouraging news. It suggests that racial disparities in America are narrowing, in part because Black kids growing up in low-income families are doing better. But I want to emphasize that there still remain large racial disparities in economic opportunity. And to see that, we can just juxtapose the two maps that I just showed you earlier on the same slide using the data for the most recent cohort, the kids born in 1992, Black children on the left, white children on the right. And the key point I want to make here, and the reason we chose different color scales for these two maps, is that if you look at the bottom of the slide, you can see that the spectrum of colors, the distributions, are essentially completely non-overlapping. The very best places for upward mobility for Black children, where they can go on to expect to earn about $26,000 a year, they offer worse outcomes than the very worst places for upward mobility for white children, even in the most recent cohorts. So on the one hand, it's true that racial disparities in America are narrowing, and it turns out that class, the divide between low and high income people, is becoming more important relative to the divide by race. Yet at the same time, it remains the case that racial disparities in economic opportunity, even controlling for class, remain very large. And in my view, this captures some of the tension that we see in the public narrative at the moment, where you have two different worldviews about what's going on, and both are to some extent borne out in the data. Now, despite that tension, one interpretation one may have when you look at these data, sometimes people are concerned, is what we're seeing here that one group is gaining at the expense of the other? Is it that Black kids are having better opportunities and somehow that's what's leading to worse opportunities for white children? I want to emphasize that that is definitely not what we're seeing in the data. And the way we can see that very clearly is by plotting the data on changes in economic mobility for Black children on the vertical axis here for the 50 largest counties against the data for changes in economic mobility for white children on the horizontal axis. And what you can see is that there's a clear positive relationship. If we were living in a zero-sum world where one group's gains came at the other group's expense, this line would be downward sloping, right? We'd see that in the places where Black children gain the most, white children were falling the most. But that is not what you see. In fact, what you see is in the places where Black children are gaining the most, those are exactly the counties where we're seeing the least reduction in economic mobility for white kids. And so what these data suggest is that we all rise together or fall together. It's not that this is a zero-sum game where we have to think about how one group gets ahead at the expense of the other. I think the key point here is that the total size of the pie, it's how economists would think about it, is not fixed. There are gains to be had for everyone if we can figure out how to promote economic mobility. Now, before turning to how we might actually go about doing so, what are the drivers of these trends in economic mobility, these differences across places? What have we learned about the determinants? I want to make one final descriptive point. I'll focus throughout this talk primarily on economic outcomes, but I know there are many folks here who are interested in a wide variety of other outcomes, as we all should be. And in particular, I think there's a lot of interest in health outcomes and understanding opportunities for better health, which is, of course, a key aspect of well-being and success in life. And a point I want to make is that while I'll focus on economic outcomes, my view is that economic mobility is highly intertwined with success on other dimensions as well. And so I want to show you some other data quickly in the context of work we're doing on health inequality that underscores that point. The trends that I've just shown you on how racial gaps are shrinking in economic mobility and class gaps are growing, that is, low-income white children are falling behind, whereas kids from high-income white families are doing better. Those same trends are mirrored when we look at health outcomes. So in some ongoing work, we're using data from the population of tax records linked to Social Security Administration data on mortality. And we're using that population data to compute measures of life expectancy by income. Here I'm showing you the data for white people in 2001. And you can see first that there's a very large gradient even in 2001 of life expectancy by income, roughly 12 or 14-year gap in life expectancy between the richest Americans and the poorest Americans. Just to put that in context, the CDC estimates that if we were to eliminate cancer as a cause of death, we would increase average life expectancy by 3.2 years. So this 14-year gap in life expectancy is absolutely enormous relative to that benchmark. Now, what's more, this gap is only growing over time. When we replicate these statistics for white people in 2019, you can see that that gradient has become steeper. At the bottom of the distribution, despite technological progress, life expectancy is actually falling over the past 2 decades, whereas at the top, it's grown by 3 years. It's sort of like you've cured cancer, or the analog of that for people at the top of the income distribution. And so you can see how class is becoming a more important determinant of health outcomes in the US. Now, once again, we can look at this data for Black people as well. And so this is the same curve of life expectancy by income for Black folks in 2001, where you can see throughout the income distribution, even controlling for income, Black people are living about 2 years shorter lives than white people in 2001. But then remarkably, if you plot the same series for Black people in 2019, you see a systematic jump across the income distribution, this really encouraging progress of substantial gains in life expectancy, such that it actually turns out that conditional on income, there is no longer a Black-white gap in life expectancy in America as of 2019, right before the pandemic, as you can see with the purple and orange lines overlapping. So I think these data are of interest in and of themselves, but they also echo a broader point that I've seen in many different studies and other social scientists have documented, that the patterns we see in terms of economic outcomes, where people are thriving economically, are also reflected for a broad range of other outcomes, including health outcomes. And so with that motivation, I'm going to focus in the next part of the talk now on understanding the determinants of economic mobility. I hope you'll all keep in mind that this is also going to be relevant, the same factors I'm describing here, for other outcomes you may be interested in as well. So to understand these determinants, a first step that we found very useful is to recognize that the drivers of these differences in economic mobility that I showed you in those initial maps, they actually emerge at a much more local level than you might have expected. So in the initial maps I was showing you, we were comparing different cities, different regions, higher mobility in the Midwest and the Southeast and so on. But it turns out that when you zoom in and look at these data at a much finer level, at a very local level, here shown at the census tract level in the Philadelphia area, you see just as much variation in economic mobility. And let me just note, if you're interested in looking at these data for your own area, you can go to a website called the Opportunity Atlas, opportunityatlas.org, type in your own home address, and you can zoom in to look at what economic mobility looks like for people in your own neighborhood. So here, looking at the map of Philadelphia, which some of you here, especially those at Penn, will be familiar with, the simple point I want to make is that the spectrum of colors that you're seeing on this map is the same as the spectrum of colors that I showed you on the national map. And we've not changed the color scale here. So what this is telling you is that you can drive a few miles down the road in Philadelphia, and it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of kids' chances of rising up. And so that simple observation, I think, is extremely important because it shows us that the types of determinants we should be thinking about for economic mobility are not things that vary at the national level or the state level or across different labor markets. No, it's often about what's happening on one side of the street versus the other side of the street, in one neighborhood versus another neighborhood. And that may get you thinking about certain types of mechanisms, maybe the types of schools kids attend, the environments they're in, who they're interacting with, things that vary at a very local level. Clearly, that's where a lot of the action is. Now, to understand more precisely what exactly matters here, the next step we took in our analysis was to try to figure out how much of the variation we're seeing in these maps reflects the causal effect of growing up in one place versus another place, versus selection, that is different types of people living in different places. This is, of course, an age-old question in the social sciences, going back to debates about nature versus nurture. How much does environment matter for shaping people's outcomes? Now, the way we looked at that, and others have now done in a series of studies, is by quite intuitively looking at people who move across neighborhoods. I'm going to briefly describe some results from a study where we looked at 5 million families that moved across census tracts in the United States. Rather than getting into the statistical details of that study, I'm going to summarize what we found in the context of a simple example drawn from the Philadelphia area, where I want you to think about a set of families that start out living in a part of the city in North Philadelphia called Nicetown, which is a place where kids who grow up in low-income families from birth end up earning about $21,000 on average in adulthood. So it's one of those red-colored parts of the map where, unfortunately, we're not seeing great outcomes for kids who grow up there. Now, I want you to think about a set of families who move from Nicetown to a place called Oak Lane, which is a place that offers much better prospects for upward mobility. The kids who grow up there from birth are earning more than maybe $33,000 a year. So imagine a set of families who move from Nicetown to Oak Lane with kids of different ages, starting with families who move when their child is exactly 2 years old. So what we do is trace that kid who moves when they're exactly 2 in this example, forward 30 years and measure their own earnings when they're adults, when they're in their 30s. And we see in this first green dot here that those children are earning on average about $30,400 when they're in their 30s. So that's for children who move when they're exactly 2. Now let's repeat that analysis, looking at children who move when they're 3, 4, 5, and so on, who make exactly that same move from Nicetown to Oak Lane in this example, or more generally, from a red-colored part of the map to a green-colored part of the map. What you see is a very clear declining pattern. The later you make the move from a lower mobility area to a higher mobility area, the less of a gain you get. And if you move after you're in your early 20s, the relationship becomes completely flat and you get no gain at all. So what do you see from this chart? I think there are 3 key takeaways. First, where you grow up really seems to matter for your life outcomes. It's not just that different people live in different places. Apparently, if you take a given child and move that child to a different environment, you see fundamentally different life outcomes for that child. I think that's an incredibly encouraging result. It shows that these problems are fixable. We don't need to look to a different era, a different country. Often we can find the answer a few miles down the road in our own city. Second, what we see is that what really matters for kids' outcomes is childhood environment as opposed to where you live in adulthood. We find this in this study and a number of other studies as well. Moves once after age 23 or so have relatively little impact on later outcomes. And the third thing you see is that there's a very clear dosage effect of exposure to a better environment. The earlier you move to a better area, the better you do. Now, this is very important from a policy perspective. As all of you know, there's been a lot of emphasis on early childhood intervention, things like pre-K programs and so on. We think those kinds of interventions can have very high returns, but we see here that if you move to a better neighborhood when you're 10 instead of 15 or 15 instead of 20, you can still gain a lot. So it's not like everything's set in stone, after you're 5 or 6. There's still a lot of malleability at later ages. And so I think what that shows us is that we should be focused on improving environment throughout childhood, from birth until people are entering the labor market. So having shown that there does seem to be a significant causal effect of environmental factors on children's outcomes, the natural next question is, what is it that's different about places like Oak Lane versus Nicetown, the green-colored parts of the map versus the red-colored parts of the map? Now, since we've put out these data publicly, we and many other social scientists have correlated the publicly available data from the Opportunity Atlas with numerous factors, more than 100 papers written on the determinants of economic mobility using these sorts of data. I'm going to summarize the 4 strongest patterns that people have found to date in terms of predictors of economic mobility. The first is that we find that high mobility areas tend to have lower poverty rates. They tend to be mixed income areas. Second, they tend to have more stable family structures. They tend to have more 2-parent families, for example. Third, as you might expect intuitively, they tend to have better schools, both in terms of access to K through 12 education, as well as access to higher education. And finally, they tend to have greater social capital. Now, this notion of social capital is a term you've surely heard, a term social scientists have used for more than 100 years, but it's meant different things to different people. Some people use social capital to refer to the strength of a community, to who your friends are, to how much people trust each other. There are different definitions that people have put forth over the years. Social capital historically has been something that's very difficult to measure on scale because we haven't had systematic data on what friendships look like, what networks look like, and so on. This is again a case where large-scale data, living in the era of big data, we can make progress on these kinds of questions. We had the hypothesis in our group that social capital might be quite important, so we set up a collaboration with Meta, the company that operates the Facebook social network platform, and constructed various measures of social capital at a very granular level. I'm going to focus on one of them in this set of maps here, where the map on the left is the same map of upward mobility that I've shown you from the beginning that's constructed using tax records. The map on the right is completely different. It's a map of what we're calling economic connectedness. It's a simple measure of social capital that we constructed using data on 72 million Facebook users, where what we're measuring is among people with below median income on Facebook, what fraction of their Facebook friends have above median income, county by county. In the map on the right, the green colors represent counties where low-income people have more high-income friends. The red colors represent places where low-income people have fewer high-income friends, where there's more disconnection by class. And you can see the result immediately for yourself. You don't even need to do any statistics here. It's totally obvious that the map on the right looks incredibly similar to the map on the left. This is the single strongest predictor of economic mobility that we or anyone else has identified to date. And once again, this pattern emerges not just at the national level, but if we zoom into the local level, you're illustrating with the case of Philadelphia, it's exactly the areas that have the most disconnection along class lines socially that also offer the poorest prospects for upward mobility and correspondingly the poorest health outcomes and so on for kids growing up in low-income families. Now, in ongoing work, we show that much of this link, this correlational link that I'm showing you in the slide, appears to be driven by the causal effect of interaction across class lines using various research designs that essentially manipulate how exposed people are to folks from higher income backgrounds. Why exactly that is, we don't know yet. I think is a very interesting question for future research. It could be about things like job referrals, that if you're more connected to high income folks, they're more likely to get you an internship or a job at a high paying company. But I think at a deeper level, it's more likely to be about things like aspirations. If you've never met anyone who's gone to college, you don't even think about that as something on your radar screen, something you might think about pursuing. And when you're in a more connected environment, it reshapes what children end up doing. Whatever the underlying mechanism, it's clear that this is a key driver of economic mobility, and in my view, one that has not been as much of a focus of policy attention as some of the other areas. And so in that vein, in the remaining time, I want to pivot to talk about how we can use the set of research findings I just shared in order to, going forward, implement policies that can increase upward mobility. And I'm going to focus on three areas that our group our research group at Harvard Opportunity Insights is currently focused on that I think flow naturally from the set of research findings that have been identified over the past decade on these issues. So just to summarize in a nutshell, what have we learned about the science of economic opportunity? If I were to summarize that in one or two sentences, I would say the determinants of economic mobility are hyperlocal. It's about the environment in which you're growing up in something like a 1 mile radius around your house. And what matters is environmental conditions like schools and social connections and so on from birth to early adulthood. So if you have that view of the world, I think you'd naturally think about three different ways to increase economic mobility going forward. The first is to reduce segregation. So if I know that there are better opportunities to be had in Philadelphia or in any other city, and by going a couple miles down the road, maybe I can help more low-income families move to those higher opportunity neighborhoods, a moving to opportunity approach. And as I'll show in a second, I think that's certainly one actionable course we can pursue. But of course, moving to opportunity is not an entirely scalable approach. We can't move everyone to a different neighborhood. So that motivates what I think is maybe a more scalable approach, place-based investment, taking the red colored parts of the map and trying to turn them into green colors, bringing opportunity to people where they are rather than moving people to opportunity. The third approach is making investments in higher education. The key touch point for most kids after they're age 18 is not the home in which they live, but the institution of higher education they might attend. And I think that there's a lot that we can do to amplify the impacts of our higher education system on economic mobility. So let me spend a few minutes on each of these different areas before concluding. So let's start with the reducing segregation approach. I'm going to show you again a snapshot of the Opportunity Atlas data for Philadelphia, where now we've overlaid in the black dots the most common places where people receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. Just as a bit of institutional background, in the United States, we spend about $60 billion per year on affordable housing programs, the largest component of which goes to housing choice vouchers, which goes to about 2.5 million families, provides rental assistance worth something like $1,000 or $1,500 a month to give families a chance to find more stable housing in better neighborhoods that might help them escape poverty. Now, if you look at where these black dots are located, you might notice a puzzling pattern, which is that despite the fact that families are receiving this assistance from the government, they are still concentrated in the lowest opportunity parts of the city. They're not using these vouchers to move to the green colored parts of the city where we've established through the work that I just discussed that they would have a much better chance of rising out of poverty. So when we put out the Opportunity Atlas data, a number of housing authorities noticed this pattern, and folks in the Housing and Urban Development Agency contacted us and said, what do you think is going on? Is there something that we can do about this? And so what came out of those conversations was a collaboration that we set up in the city of Seattle to try to test why families are not using these vouchers to move to higher opportunity areas. Here you see the same pattern in the Seattle area where families receiving housing vouchers shown in the black dots, the most common locations, they tend to be clustered in the low opportunity parts of the city. So we set about to assess the extent to which this might be driven by barriers that are preventing families from moving to higher opportunity places. Could be things like informational barriers, barriers in the housing search process that make it difficult to find housing in a very different neighborhood, versus just preferences, right? So the things people care about, it's not just how well their kids do, but you might also be concerned about living in a community where you feel comfortable or close to your job or close to your family. And maybe there are other good reasons that people want to stay in these lower opportunity areas. So we set about to test between those explanations and see if you could make the housing voucher more effective at providing pathways to economic opportunity by setting up a randomized trial in collaboration with the Seattle Housing Authority, where 1,000 people or so came in to apply for housing vouchers through the normal process. Half of them just got the voucher and were told that they had 4 months to find housing wherever they'd like. The other half essentially got what I would think of as a social capital, social support intervention. Some support in the housing search process in the form of a counselor who helped them find housing in a neighborhood that was high opportunity if they wanted to move there, who came and negotiated with landlords on their behalf, who provided a little bit of short-term financial assistance, say a security deposit or an application fee if a family really needed that to make the transaction work. And so we set this up as an RCT, followed families over time, looked at where they ended up moving, and here are the results. In the control group, consistent with the maps that I was showing you, only 14% of families ended up moving to one of those green colored areas in Seattle. In the treatment group, that number jumps up to 54%. Now, just to give you some sense of context for magnitudes of these effects, this intervention costs about $2,500 per family. It's not cheap. It's not like a very low cost nudge. But relative to the cost of the program that we're already spending, we're spending about $100,000 per family on this rental assistance month after month as they have these vouchers. It's about a 2% incremental cost on existing expenditures. And what's more, we estimate based on our prior work that the kids who got lucky and end up in the green, they're going to go on to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes relative to the kids in the control group as a result of living in these different neighborhoods. And so the rate of return on that incremental $2,500 investment is incredibly high, more than pays for itself from a social perspective. And so this, I think, is an illustration of how we can use modern data and methods to really fine-tune programs on which we're already spending billions of dollars to make them much more efficient and have much greater impact ultimately on economic mobility. Now, this study we did in Seattle has since been replicated by HUD in randomized trials they've run in 8 other cities across America and shown that you get the same 4 to 6-fold increase in rates of moves to opportunity. And there's now bipartisan support in Congress for trying to expand housing vouchers going forward in light of this sort of evidence. So an example of how I think doing this kind of research can really have an impact on policy in a constructive way and potentially increase opportunities for many kids going forward. So let me now turn to the next bucket of place-based investment. I think the moving to opportunity approach is a very useful approach on a small scale, but we need to simultaneously be thinking about how we can bring opportunity to the most distressed neighborhoods. And here, let me give you an example from some ongoing work that we're doing, a paper that we'll be releasing publicly later this year that studies the biggest neighborhood revitalization program to date in the United States, what's called the Hope 6 Neighborhood Revitalization Program, on which the federal government in partnership with local partners spent about $17 billion to revitalize 261 high poverty public housing projects and turn them into mixed income communities. Here's an illustration in Philadelphia. These are the Milk Creek homes in Philadelphia on the left, a large public housing project that was demolished, revitalized. Here's the exact same piece of land, what's now called the Lucien Blackwell homes in Philadelphia, which you can see, looks incredibly different. So essentially the question we're asking in this study, which we haven't known the answer to, is if I were to randomly assign you to grow up in the housing project on the left versus that same piece of land on the right, would your outcomes look different in adulthood? We answer that question by linking data from HUD to information from tax records to follow children over time using a matching approach where we compare the outcomes of kids in revitalized projects relative to very similar projects that were not revitalized due to a lack of funding. Let me again skip the statistical details of the study in the interest of time and summarize what we find with a simple chart. So what we're doing here is an event study of children's outcomes around the time of revitalization. And so if you look first at the dot at -10, what it's telling you is that children who grew up, if we take the set of children who grew up in these public housing projects that were subsequently revitalized 10 years before that point, and followed those kids over time and measured their own earnings in adulthood, we see that those kids who were growing up there 10 years before revitalization, they're earning on average about $25,000 a year. The same is true for kids who were growing up there 9 years before the revitalization, 8 years before the revitalization, and so on. You can see it's essentially a flat line. Then the revitalization occurs, and now we can look at the data using the same exact approach, look at the set of children who are growing up in these neighborhoods after revitalization, and you can see this very clear upward trajectory. It takes some time for the neighborhood to be fully revitalized, resettled, and so on. If you look 10 years after that point, kids are earning about $4,000 more per year who grow up in these areas relative to the kids who were growing up in the exact same areas before, something like a 20% increase in earnings. And when we dig into the mechanisms for what's driving this, once again, we come back to finding evidence for the social capital mechanism. We see very clearly in the data that the kids in revitalized projects are spending more time interacting with peers in surrounding neighborhoods. We use anonymized information from cell phone pings to look at where people are spending their time in order to document that. And we find that it's exactly in the neighborhoods where the surrounding communities are thriving that this kind of revitalization, where you get connected to peers who are doing better, that's where you see the largest gains. Again, suggesting that, essentially the mental model I have is the public housing projects as they existed before here on the left were essentially like islands cut off from the surrounding area. Through revitalization, we built bridges to the surrounding area, and that social interaction, often with peers who are doing better, has ended up leading to much better outcomes for the kids living in public housing afterward. And so that, I think, is a very encouraging set of results, showing that although this program, again, was incredibly expensive upfront, $17 billion, the returns, when you add this up over numerous kids growing up in these projects over many different cohorts, again, this is an incredibly high rate of return for society. Now, this is a very large scale, direct place-based investment where we're literally tearing down a community and rebuilding it. We're not going to be able to do that. We're not going to want to do that in every place. There are, of course, many other things one can do. I just want to throw up some examples of interesting initiatives, some of which we have already preliminary data suggesting that they're working well. There are lots of things that you can do in schools, things like the Harlem Children's Zone, programs like communities in schools, efforts to increase cross-class interaction. I think there are many other ways to try to bring opportunity to places, and this is a key area for focus going forward. Finally, let me turn to higher education and workforce training. Much as our team has constructed data on how economic mobility varies across every neighborhood in America, we've also constructed statistics on every college's contribution to economic mobility. So in this chart here, each college in America is represented by a dot. We're using data on 30 million students who attended these colleges from anonymized tax records linked to Department of Education information. And using that data, we're calculating two measures that matter for colleges' contributions to economic mobility. On the vertical axis is what we're calling the upward mobility rate. So this is among the set of students who come from low-income families, the bottom 20% of the income distribution. What fraction of them, when we follow them 10 years after college, end up reaching the top 20% of the income distribution? And so you can see places like Harvard and Yale, Penn, and Stanford, and so on, fare very well on that dimension. The vast majority of low-income students who attend these institutions end up reaching the upper middle class or beyond after college. But what matters for a college's contribution to economic mobility is not just how well low-income students on campus do, but how many low-income students we have on campus to begin with. And that's what's shown on the horizontal axis, the fraction of students attending these colleges who come from families in the bottom 20%. And you can see that, unfortunately, on that dimension, places like Harvard and Penn and so on don't fare very well. They have very few students, 3% or so, coming from the bottom 20%. And as a result, just mechanically, they cannot be contributing a whole lot to economic mobility. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a number of community colleges in America that are serving many low-income kids. But unfortunately, when we look at their outcomes, we see that these dots are not very high. That is, kids don't end up having terrific trajectories after they attend these institutions. And so conceptually, one way to think about the problem in the United States in terms of economic mobility is that there are essentially no dots in the upper right side of this chart. There are no colleges, there are very few colleges in America that both serve many low-income kids and deliver great outcomes after college. And so I think the challenge we face in the direction we need to move is essentially figure out how to move these dots over to the right and how to move the community colleges that are serving many low-income kids upward. Now, how can we do that? I find it interesting to focus on some exceptions to the pattern. Let me highlight one here called the Vaughn College of Aeronautics and Technology. It's a small college in Queens, New York, which does exactly what you'd expect from its name. It trains people in aeronautics and technology. Now, that's a case where giving that particular training, which many low-income kids are able to access, launches you into a career that puts you well into the middle class and apparently creates a path to economic mobility for a number of children. I highlight this example because it illustrates, I think, something we need to spend more time on in the context of higher education in the US, which is essentially modern-day versions of vocational training that try to give people access to jobs directly, equip them with technical skills, as well as the social capital needed to acquire these jobs. Now, what does that look like? I want to end here showing you one final set of data from the types of programs that we're finding very effective in this context. So here I'm highlighting one such program called Year Up, which is a job training program that brings people in for a year, gives them a particular set of technical skills, could be in IT, could be in financial operations, something like that. Additionally, critically, connects them with an internship, provides them a network, provides them wraparound mentoring, that social capital that I've been emphasizing throughout this presentation. And we see in randomized trials, this is a randomized trial conducted in 2014, where we link the Year Up information to information from tax records. We see that when people enroll in the job training program, the treated group's earnings shown in the green dip relative to the control because they're participating in the job training program. But then afterward, their earnings surge and they're about $9,000, 35% higher, essentially permanently, after they participate in this one-year program relative to the control, showing that this targeted job training can be a really powerful pathway to economic mobility, importantly, when coupled with the social capital support. Earlier versions of this type of job training that simply gave technical skills and didn't provide that additional social capital show essentially no impact. And so that's another area where I think, that can be expanded. It's another demonstration that there are things we can do in our higher education system to greatly expand economic opportunity. Let me end on one final note. I've shown you a bunch of data, a bunch of research on how I think we can make important advances in expanding economic opportunity in America. Lots of people ask me, especially students, this is all very interesting. In this polarized era, do people really pay attention to evidence? Does this really make a difference for folks, on the ground? And I have found quite encouragingly that despite the politically charged times in which we live, there's still great appetite for understanding what the evidence says and for taking action based on that. And so I want to end by giving you some illustrations of that. I mentioned earlier how Charlotte is a city with very low levels of economic mobility, in fact, ranked 50th out of the 50 largest cities in America when we put out our 2014 study. That was noticed in Charlotte. It led to them creating a task force and a commission to try to improve economic mobility in Charlotte, leading to $160 million of investment in workforce development by big companies like Bank of America, so on, and programs like Year Up that I just described, various initiatives in the early childhood context to increase economic mobility, to monitor outcomes. And so I think that's been incredibly inspiring to see. What's more, when we look at our data 10 years later on how opportunity is changing across places, we see that change is, in fact, possible. So Charlotte, North Carolina, it turns out, ranks among the most improved cities in economic mobility over the past decade. Unfortunately, Philadelphia now turns out to be 50th out of 50 in terms of changes in economic mobility. But once again, we see that showing people these data and showing how we can make change can be a real motivator. Just last week, I was actually in Philadelphia meeting with the mayor and presenting at the Federal Reserve Bank, where the mayor, in light of this sort of evidence, announced a new $20 million investment that will seed a broader set of programs in workforce training to improve economic mobility in Philadelphia. And so I want to leave you all on that positive note that despite the challenges we currently face, I think these are some of the greatest challenges of our time. Change is possible, and I think science and data can make a difference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Raj. This was an amazing talk, and I will say there's been it's been fun to see all the emojis popping up. There's been a bunch with mouths open, and that would be the best description of how Angela and I spent this talk, was like, wow, and wow, this is so important, it's so interesting. So thank you for that. We're all very inspired. We have tons of questions. We won't get to all of them, but I actually I get to go first, and then Athene gets to go second. I don't know who decided that, coin flip, hopefully. So the first question I wanted to ask you is about the need for experiments. So we were chatting a little bit before the seminar started about how hard it is to run these randomized controlled trials and whether or not big data can solve any of these puzzles you're trying to disentangle when you run RCTs to try to generate causal evidence.
Yeah, absolutely, Katie. So, I ended showing you an example, and I showed you a couple of examples along the way of RCTs that we've run. You all have run a number of RCTs that have been incredibly illuminating. But as you well know, running a randomized trial is very challenging. When you approach a city or approach a local partner saying, do you want to know if this program works? You should run a randomized trial. It's often met with hesitation, skepticism. It's going to be costly to run, denying people services, and so on. So we have recently, and I've become interested in understanding whether in the age of big data, we might be able to use other methods to essentially replicate what we're learning from randomized trials. There's a long history in the social sciences of being interested in what are called matching methods, essentially looking for twins in observational data for a given person who may have participated in a program and asking, can I find somebody who looks just like that person, maybe compare their outcomes, and would I replicate what I get from an RCT? And traditionally, this work goes back to the 80s and 90s. People found that with more limited data sets, those kinds of approaches did not work very well, and that's what has led to the focus on experiments and quasi-experiments. But recently, we've revisited that using the large-scale administrative tax data, hundreds of millions of observations, to see whether in the age of big data, these kinds of methods can work. And I'm just going to quickly share my screen again and just show you, the upshot of that. So I had ended, the last empirical result I showed you was from this year up evaluation, right, of the randomized treatment group versus the randomized control in the orange. Now what we're doing is superimposing in the black line what we're calling a matched control group, which is a set of people we found in the tax data. For every person in the treatment group, we go find somebody of the exact same age, same sex, same race, same state, same prior earnings trajectory. Think of that as like your digital twin. And then we're plotting the average earnings for the people in that matched control. And what's beautiful about this is you can see that that matched control, which did not require us to run the experiment, that earnings trajectory looks almost identical to the control group that you had in the randomized experiment. So the implication of that is that if I estimate the treatment effect of participating in the program using the matching method, which is what's shown here, 0 impact before you participate in the program, negative impact while you're in it, and then about a $9,000 earnings gain afterward, that it pretty much exactly matches what you get from the randomized trial. So this is one example from this Year Up program. We've now replicated this for 13 different programs and sites where we're plotting estimates from RCTs on the vertical axis against estimates from this matching method on the horizontal axis. And you can see how well correlated those are. So I was mentioning there's some job training programs that generate these incredible $20,000 earnings gains. There are others that unfortunately have essentially 0 impact. You could have figured that out almost perfectly without even running the RCT. So the reason I think that's so powerful going forward, Katie, if that holds up in other contexts, is it gives us a tool that allows us to evaluate things as they just are out there in the field and create this feedback loop where we can see as we implement programs in different places, are they scaling? Is fidelity being maintained? Where does it work better? And so on.
It's fascinating and really encouraging. And Angela and I are jotting notes down. We're like, oh, we could go back for our mega studies and look at untreated samples and see if we can do this. And so really inspiring and generative. Thank you. Let me pass the baton to Athene to ask the next question.
Yeah, just wanted to echo Katie. I know with Epic Cosmos and some of these other large data sets in health, it's possible to attain the kind of numbers to find these similar exact matches. So it'll be really great to be able to apply this method in other settings. So this is going to be a question from the audience, and it relates to what you were talking about with the cohorts from 1978 to 1992 in terms of their changes in economic mobility. So the participant asked said they're very curious about whether men and women's trajectories are different. Noting the extensive changes in women's professional and economic opportunities and participation from 1978 onward. So I was curious if you had done that split.
Great question. So there's a significant interaction between race and gender in particular. So what we find before we get to changes in levels is that the black-white difference in economic mobility is entirely driven by men rather than women. So if you look at Black women controlling for parental income, they have basically the same outcomes as white women, same levels of educational attainment, same earnings, and so on. If you look at Black men, there's an enormous divide relative to white men. And so Athene, you see that going back to 1978. That's very important in terms of understanding where these disparities are emerging. And then how things are changing over time is that we're seeing significant progress for Black men in particular and deterioration for white men in particular. And I think that's consistent with some of the broader narratives you hear about. While women are relatively stable, you still see qualitatively the same patterns that I've been describing here, but it's attenuated in terms of magnitudes.
Thank you. Katie, to you.
All right, we're doing baton passing. Do you have any data where instead of people moving from one place to another or an RCT, the place has changed in ways that favor mobility and what that looks like?
Yeah. So, that's what I was calling the place-based investment or the place-focused approach, which I think is absolutely an area we should be focusing on. We know less about it than the moving to opportunity approach, both because that's been just historically studied more. Also, it's easier to study than changing a place. But as I was starting to show you with this HOPE 6 study that our team will be putting out later this year, that's an example of, literally a given place changing, opportunity being brought to that particular place, and the same set of people living in that area afterward versus before, same demographic group, same characteristics, they have dramatically different outcomes. So to me, just that simple demonstration that you can take some of the harshest neighborhoods in our country and bring opportunity to those places, that shows you that change is possible. More to be done in terms of figuring out exactly the most effective way to do that. But as I was emphasizing, I think these notions of social capital and connection are very important in that context as well.
I'm going to pass to Athene.
Yeah, thank you. There's so many good questions from the audience. I just want to say I appreciate the audience for their engagement here. So one that came up, this is a quote: "As a person living in rural Western South Dakota, it seems that the policy approaches mentioned work well for urban communities. Those that work well for urban communities may not be as tailored to rural places like mine. Out of the three policy approaches that you describe, are there some that are better suited for rural communities like the one I live in?"
Yeah, it's an excellent question. You could see the rural divide, in the United States, where much of the rural Midwest, actually parts of South Dakota and so on, have very high rates of economic mobility, but then much of the rural South does not. My view is that it's the same set of factors that matter. The particular policy interventions you might take might look different. But, I'll give you an anecdotal example. My wife grew up in a small town in Southern Illinois. Her dad was the town doctor. There were 7,000 people who lived there. If you look at her social circle of friends, it's exactly exhibited that economic connectedness that I was describing earlier. There was no other game in town. There was one public school. You'd be friends with whoever is there. And I think a lot of rural areas can benefit from that sort of social capital. That's exactly why I think a number of rural areas in the Midwest in particular tend to have high economic connectedness and high levels of economic mobility. So it's the same set of, we actually don't find very different correlations in rural and urban areas. But of course, the particular policy interventions one wants to take, it's not directly going to be about desegregation or building large-scale public housing towers, et cetera, but it's about maintaining access to jobs, to having vitality that kids are seeing mentors and connections and having support in schools, that helps them thrive, I think all of those factors remain very relevant in rural areas.
Thank you, and appreciate that anecdote. I think it's a really great illustration. Katy.
We have another question from the audience that feels very of the moment because there's so much discussion of immigration. And the question is about the extent to which these findings relate to immigrant communities. So you particularly focused on divides between Black and white Americans. Could you tell us a little bit about divides between immigrant and non-immigrant families and the extent to which these interventions are beneficial for those different populations?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the data that I showed you here today, that was for people who grew up in the United States, not people who immigrated to the United States. Now, we have also, in other work, constructed statistics for immigrants and by country of origin and done this over time. I would point you to the work of scholars named Ronnie Bromitsky at Stanford and Leah Bustan at Princeton, who have used our modern data as well as rich historical data they've collected. And they really have two key findings. One is that immigrants have historically and today have systematically higher rates of upward mobility than Americans. And so you tend to see that when immigrants come to the United States, they themselves in that generation don't necessarily move up that much, but their kids tend to move up a lot in the distribution. Second, why is that happening? One of the interesting patterns they document is overlaying on the maps that I was showing you here. They show that immigrants tend to choose to live in the neighborhoods that offer the best prospects for upward mobility. Think of it again anecdotally as someone who buys the smallest house in the best school district in order to give their kids a shot. I think of that as kind of a selection effect. My own parents came to this country in search of opportunity for their children. That was the focus, that was the goal. I think when immigrants come with that goal, you're going to do whatever it takes, buy that smallest house in the best school district in order to help your kids get ahead. And that seems to be a key driver of this pattern and is very consistent with the mechanisms we talked about today.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. Athene, I think I'll let you have the final word.
Yeah, I think we're heading towards closing. But first things first, Professor Chetty, thank you so much for coming and talking to us about this really inspiring and wide-spanning body of work. I think those of us in Philadelphia appreciate it for the specific insights here and what we can do to improve our communities and just how some of these insights really generalize across the country. Thank you so much for that. To everyone, thank you for your engagement in the seminar. The questions are wonderful. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I wish this could be a 2-hour event so we could hit all of it, but perhaps another time. Overall, we hope you've enjoyed today's keynote event and that you'll join us again for a final seminar of the series featuring Professor Hengchen Dai. The flyer for her seminar is about to be shown. And really, Professor Chetty, thank you so much for generously sharing your time and wisdom with us. And for the rest of you, if you'd like to stay in the loop of future events, make sure to subscribe to CHIBE and BCFG newsletters or follow us on Blue Sky or X. Thanks for joining us. And again, really incredible lecture. Hope to hear more in the future. Yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.